Open-source trackers say a Russian warship appears to be escorting two sanctioned cargo ships near NATO's southern maritime flank. According to ship tracking data and OSINT analysts, the convoy was observed south of Portugal on January 9th. Trackers describe the escort as unusual for this route, but what it means depends on what the ships are carrying, still unknown. The escort comes soon after U.S. officials announced the seizure of a Russian-linked oil tanker. Some analysts interpret the escort as a signal and a deterrent, but Moscow hasn't publicly explained the purpose. The deployment raises immediate questions. What are these ships carrying? Where are they really going? And how will the situation develop if American forces encounter Russian naval escorts protecting sanctioned vessels? The convoy consists of 3 vessels, according to maritime tracking and open-source intelligence analysts. The escorting warship is identified as the Severomorsk, a Udaloy-class anti-submarine warfare destroyer from Russia's Northern Fleet, commissioned in 1988. The Severomorsk carries advanced weapon systems and sensors designed for anti-submarine warfare. Its deployment alongside civilian cargo vessels is described by trackers as highly unusual. The 2 cargo ships under apparent escort are Sparta IV and MYS Zhelaniya, both tied to companies under Western sanctions, according to sanctions listings and reporting. Such direct naval escort is rare for civilian shipping in these waters, analysts note. Russia usually does not deploy this level of protection without reason, according to observers. Sparta IV is not an ordinary cargo vessel, according to sanctions documentation. Sanctions listings and analysts link Sparta IV to firms tied to Russia's military logistics ecosystem, but the exact cargo on this run is unknown. The ship is reportedly operated by SC South LLC, described in sanctions documents as connected to Oberon Logistica, a firm associated with Russia's Ministry of Defense logistics operations. Western sanctions descriptions say the network has supported military logistics. That doesn't confirm what this specific voyage is transporting. Sparta IV has been sanctioned by Western governments for its alleged role in this supply chain. AIS shows Egypt as the declared destination for both cargo vessels. OSINT analysts say past voyages suggest the ships could continue elsewhere, but the endpoint isn't confirmed. OSINT analysts say past AIS tracks show Egypt listed and later routes continuing onward, but destination decisions can change mid-voyage. Specifically, Sparta IV has previously shown routes that continued toward Russia's naval base in Tartus, Syria, according to tracking records. Tartus is Russia's only Mediterranean naval base, a strategic facility that has supported Russian operations in Syria for years. Any cargo heading there would likely be of military or strategic significance. The movement of MYS Zhelaniya has prompted speculation. Analysts say its track could support a North Africa stop, but Libya is not confirmed. The second cargo vessel, MYS Zhelaniya, has different but equally significant connections, according to reports. Reports link the ship to sanctioned firms supporting Arctic energy and infrastructure projects, including connections to ventures targeted by Western sanctions. Together, Sparta IV and MYS Zhelaniya form part of what Western governments describe as Russia's sanctioned supply chain. Though what specifically is being transported on this voyage remains unknown. Analysts describe the routing as opaque. They argue it can complicate tracking, but intent can't be proven from AIS data alone. The choice of escort vessel is significant, according to naval analysts. The Severomorsk is not a small patrol craft. It is a major surface combatant, a destroyer designed for anti-submarine warfare, commissioned during the Cold War and modernized for continued service. At over 160 meters long and displacing nearly 8,000 tons, the Severomorsk carries torpedoes, anti-submarine rockets, surface-to-air missiles, and advanced sonar systems, according to naval reference sources. Deploying such a vessel alongside cargo ships sends a message, analysts suggest, though whether that message is primarily defensive, deterrent, or symbolic remains subject to interpretation. The Northern Fleet does not typically dispatch destroyers for routine escort missions, observers note. The escort comes soon after the U.S. tanker seizures. Analysts debate whether it's connected. U.S. officials say the Russian-flagged oil tanker Marinera was seized under a U.S. court warrant in the North Atlantic. That seizure, conducted while Russian military assets were reportedly operating nearby, demonstrated American willingness to intercept Russian-linked vessels even in contested circumstances, according to reporting. Whether the Severomorsk Escort represents a direct response to the seizure or a previously planned operation remains unclear. Moscow has not publicly commented on the convoy's purpose. U.S. officials say the Marinera was seized under the authority of a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court, according to a statement by U.S. European Command. The vessel, also known as MV Bella 1, was taken in the North Atlantic near Iceland. U.S. European Command said the tanker was tracked by USCGC Munro before the seizure. The operation was carried out in coordination with the Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security, according to the statement. The White House has ordered the Pentagon to be referred to as the Department of War in executive communications, a change reflected in some official statements. Russian state media aired images suggesting aircraft overhead during the operation. U.S. officials have not publicly detailed the boarding team or specific operational methods. Reuters reported a significant detail about the Marinera seizure. A Russian submarine and a naval warship were operating nearby during the operation, an ominous backdrop to the seizure, according to the report. Both sides stopped short of direct confrontation, Reuters noted. The presence of Russian naval assets suggests Moscow was aware of the American pursuit and had positioned forces to monitor the situation, according to analysts. That Russian forces did not intervene suggests a calculation about risks and escalation, though what calculations were made on either side remain unclear. Russia formally condemned the U.S. seizure of the Marinera. Russia's foreign ministry described it as a blatant violation of international law and a direct challenge to Russian sovereignty. The ministry warned that the operation flagrantly disregards the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the international treaty addressing freedom of navigation in global waters. Considering the incoming information regarding the presence of Russian citizens among the crew, we demand that the American side ensure their humane and dignified treatment, strictly respect their rights and interests, and not impede their speedy return to their homeland, Russia's transport ministry stated. U.S. officials argue the seizure was lawful under sanctions authority and court warrants. U.S. officials say the Marinera was part of a so-called shadow fleet used to transport oil for sanctioned states, including Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. The tanker was sanctioned by Washington in 2024 for allegedly transporting oil on behalf of a company linked to Hezbollah, according to U.S. officials. The term shadow fleet was coined by Western governments and media to describe ships that move oil outside of Western-controlled trading systems. But for Russia and other targeted nations, these ships represent legitimate commerce. Sovereign states trading with sovereign states outside of American jurisdiction, according to their framing. The fundamental disagreement is about authority. Does the United States have the right to dictate who can trade with whom across the planet? The answer depends on which legal framework one accepts. The Marinera was not the only ship seized, according to U.S. officials. U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced that American forces also seized the Panama-flagged supertanker MT Sophia in international waters near the Caribbean. Reuters reported the ship was carrying approximately 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude oil destined for China. The vessel had reportedly been operating with its transponder turned off, a common practice for ships trying to avoid detection while moving cargo subject to sanctions. This was described as the fourth such seizure in recent weeks under the maritime operations ordered by President Trump targeting Venezuelan oil exports. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth underscored the administration's position in stark terms. The blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world, Hegseth wrote on social media. The statement claims extraordinary reach. The United States is asserting the right to enforce its domestic sanctions anywhere on the planet, in international waters, against ships flying foreign flags, regardless of where they are operating. Hegseth described the operations as part of one of the most historic military missions the world has ever seen. The level of sophistication that the Senate just was briefed on and the House was briefed on at a classified level is something only the United States of America can accomplish, Hegseth said. The world is taking notice of that. Critics dispute the legal basis for such actions in international waters. Russia and some legal critics call the seizures piracy. U.S. officials argue they're lawful under sanctions and court authority. The legal framing depends on perspective. Critics cite maritime law principles about flag state jurisdiction. Washington says sanctions and legal warrants justify interdictions. The legality is contested. When the Marinera flew the Russian flag, it was, in Moscow's view, under Russian jurisdiction on the high seas. The United States boarded it based on American legal authority that Russia does not recognize. Russian lawmaker Alexei Zhuravlyov previously called similar seizures ordinary piracy and suggested Russia should respond. The contrast in framing could not be sharper. Washington calls it law enforcement. Moscow calls it piracy. International legal experts are divided. The contrast raises questions, according to critics. When Russia conducts operations to protect its interests, Western media often characterizes it as aggression. When the United States seizes vessels in international waters based on domestic sanctions, it is characterized as law enforcement. But American sanctions are not international law in the traditional sense. They are domestic measures that Washington has chosen to enforce globally. The United States is asserting the right to seize vessels anywhere in the world for violating American sanctions, not United Nations sanctions, not internationally agreed restrictions. American sanctions. If any other nation attempted this, critics argue, it would be characterized very differently. The framing reveals assumptions about whose legal authority is legitimate. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, addresses the legal framework for maritime activities. Critics cite maritime law principles about flag state jurisdiction, the idea that ships in international waters are primarily subject to the laws of the country whose flag they fly. Russia argues the United States violated these principles by seizing the Marinera in international waters without Russian consent. The United States claims authority from domestic court orders and sanctions enforcement. Washington argues these provide sufficient legal basis. The legal dispute reflects a deeper conflict. Whose law governs the oceans? The answer is contested, and different nations reach different conclusions. Russia's response appears to be evolving, according to analysts. The Severomorsk Escort suggests Moscow may be testing new approaches to protecting its maritime commerce and logistics. If Russian naval assets accompany sanctioned vessels, seizure becomes more complicated. American forces would need to decide whether to confront Russian military ships directly, a calculation with very different risks than approaching an unescorted civilian vessel. The convoy near Portugal may be a probe, testing responses, establishing patterns, sending signals about Russian capabilities, analysts suggest. Or it may be the beginning of a more systematic Russian naval escort approach for certain shipping, though Moscow has not confirmed any such policy. The location of the Russian convoy is strategically significant, according to analysts. South of Portugal puts these ships near NATO's southern maritime approaches, waters monitored closely by Western naval forces and considered strategically important by the alliance. The Mediterranean beyond is a crucial theater. Russia's base at Tartus, Syria, requires resupply through these waters. Any Russian operations in North Africa would also transit this area. By operating here with a destroyer nearby, Russia is demonstrating presence in waters NATO monitors closely. The observation raises questions in NATO capitals about Russian intentions and capabilities in these waters. If Sparta IV follows patterns shown in past tracking data, it could end up at Tartus, though this is not confirmed. Russia's naval facility at Tartus, Syria, is Moscow's only Mediterranean base, a strategic foothold that has supported Russian military operations throughout the Syrian conflict. The base requires regular resupply. Military equipment, logistics, provisions, all must be shipped through these waters. Western sanctions complicate this resupply, according to analysts. Ships carrying military cargo to Tartus face potential complications with insurance, port access, and interdiction risks. The Escort may suggest Russia is prioritizing secure delivery, though what specifically is being delivered remains unknown. The tanker seizures are part of a broader American campaign, according to reporting. Reuters and other outlets reported Maduro was captured in a U.S. operation. The situation remains politically disputed, and details are still emerging. Following those reports, Washington has moved to control Venezuelan oil exports, according to U.S. officials. The blockade targets what officials call the shadow fleet, vessels moving Venezuelan, Russian, and Iranian oil outside Western-controlled markets. Hegseth revealed a detail about negotiations. Venezuelan authorities under the interim government are reportedly asking for seized oil to be included in discussions with Washington. They understand that the only way they can move oil and generate revenue and not have economic collapse is if they cooperate and work with the United States. Hegseth said, "Oil has become leverage. Maritime interdiction has become a tool of economic pressure. China is watching these developments," according to analysts. The MT Sophia was reportedly carrying Venezuelan crude destined for China when it was seized. Chinese oil imports from sanctioned sources face similar risks to Russian shipping. If the United States can seize tankers in the Atlantic based on domestic sanctions, the same logic could apply in the Pacific. For Beijing, the tanker seizures raise questions about the security of maritime supply lines that China depends on for energy imports, analysts suggest. The implications being drawn in Beijing may shape Chinese strategic calculations for years to come. The tanker seizures must be understood as part of a broader pattern, according to analysts. In Venezuela, the situation remains fluid following reported U.S. operations. In the Atlantic, American forces seize tankers based on sanctions authority. In Iran, sanctions target oil exports to pressure the government. Across different regions and contexts, a pattern emerges, according to analysts. Washington uses control over energy markets through sanctions, seizures, and pressure on trading partners to advance foreign policy objectives. For countries dependent on oil trade, this pattern represents a vulnerability. Energy security becomes intertwined with geopolitical alignment. The greatest concern is escalation. What happens if American forces attempt to approach a vessel with Russian naval escort nearby? What if communications fail or calculations go wrong? The scenario seems unlikely. Both sides have strong reasons to avoid direct confrontation. A direct incident between American and Russian naval forces would be the most serious military encounter between the two powers in decades. The consequences are difficult to predict. Both sides have reasons to avoid such confrontation, but both sides also have reasons to demonstrate resolve. The space for miscalculation exists, analysts warn. Russia faces a calculation, according to analysts. Naval escorts for civilian shipping are resource-intensive. Destroyers that escort cargo vessels cannot perform other missions. The Northern Fleet has limited assets. Is the cost worth the benefit? That depends on what the ships are carrying and how important secure delivery is to Russian strategic interests, factors that remain unclear from public information. The Severomorsk deployment suggests Moscow has decided the calculation favors Escort, at least for these particular vessels at this particular moment. Whether this becomes a sustained pattern or a targeted operation remains to be seen. Washington also faces calculations, according to analysts. Approaching unescorted tankers is one thing. Approaching vessels with Russian naval assets nearby is quite another. The administration has demonstrated willingness to challenge Russian maritime commerce. But approaching the Russian Navy directly raises stakes dramatically. The calculation may be, approach what can be approached without confrontation, accept that some vessels will have escorts, and monitor for opportunities. Or the calculation may evolve based on circumstances. Which approach prevails will shape events in coming weeks. Russia, China, Iran, and other nations have attempted to build alternative trading systems, alternative payment mechanisms to reduce dollar dependence, alternative shipping arrangements to navigate sanctions, alternative markets to reduce dependence on Western-controlled trade. These systems remain incomplete, according to analysts. But they represent attempts to operate outside American economic control. The tanker seizures demonstrate why these alternative systems matter to targeted nations. When the United States can seize ships based on domestic sanctions, affected nations conclude they need protective capabilities. The Escort operation is one such protective measure, a statement that Russia will attempt to protect its commerce. The precedents being established will affect all nations, according to analysts. If the United States asserts the right to seize vessels in international waters based on domestic sanctions, other nations may claim similar authority. China might assert rights regarding its interests. Russia might assert rights regarding its concerns. The oceans could become spaces where multiple powers enforce competing claims. Alternatively, international legal frameworks could be strengthened, with nations agreeing to settle such disputes through legal mechanisms rather than unilateral action. Which direction develops depends on decisions being made now. The Severomorsk escort suggests a position from Moscow, analysts say. We will attempt to protect our ships, we will respond to seizures, we have capability to operate in contested waters. Whether this changes American calculations or provokes different responses remains to be seen. The convoy continues toward its declared destination, or wherever it actually goes. The escort continues. Western intelligence presumably monitors every movement. Defense Secretary Hegseth frames these operations as historic achievements. One of the most historic military missions the world has ever seen, he called it, something only the United States of America can accomplish. For supporters, this demonstrates American capability and resolve, the ability to project force globally and enforce American policy. For critics, it demonstrates something else. American willingness to act unilaterally, to seize ships in international waters, to enforce domestic sanctions through force regardless of competing legal frameworks. The framing reveals the fundamental divide in how these operations are understood around the world. The situation continues to develop. American forces continue maritime operations targeting sanctioned shipping. Russian forces have now been observed providing escort for certain vessels. Both sides are demonstrating capabilities. The ships that declare one destination but may proceed elsewhere continue their voyages. The tankers that move oil outside Western-controlled markets continue their trade. The navies that monitor each other continue their operations. Somewhere in this dynamic, patterns will stabilize, or incidents will occur. The Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Caribbean have become theaters where great power competition plays out. Every convoy, every operation, every escort shapes the developing situation. The world is watching as tensions develop. A Russian destroyer has been observed near sanctioned cargo transiting NATO's maritime approaches. American forces seize tankers in international waters. Both sides stop short of direct confrontation, for now. The rules governing maritime commerce, and the competing claims about whose law applies, are being tested. For nations dependent on freedom of navigation, the stakes are significant. For nations targeted by American sanctions, the lesson is being absorbed. Protective capabilities may be necessary. The relationship between Washington and Moscow has entered a tense chapter. Observers are watching the seas where these dynamics play out. The world watches and waits.